Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new malicious compliance stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first story is titled, Trick Me? Claim all of my work for you and your slackers? Watch it backfire. Cast, Sam, my big brother, lazy, slackers, boss, big boss, VP, me. Small background, my brother was working at an at-will employer in charge of making small commercials for local and very rarely state companies' businesses. Think of a small airplane hangar with 60-ish employees. And a studio apartment for the higher-ups. The setup, my brother was a gopher for his lazy manager and his 4 slacker employees. His usual job was all of their work while they were out of the office, going to bars and strip clubs. My brother was told that they were going to important business meetings during all these times. And one day he got a text from our mum and dad that said with pictures, "Hey, we found your manager and co-workers at the strip club." When he got this text, he checked the company work records and saw that they had all taken credit for his work and left his name out of it. The boss came down to his section of the office and told me that he was being reprimanded for not doing any work for the past month. He was told in an email that he was on an unpaid suspension for the next month with the big boss and VP CC'd in the email. Cue the malicious compliance. My brother and his team were to oversee a multi-million, $3 million or so, contract commercial for a company that was to be in the Super Bowl 2016. Can you see where this is going? My brother, knowing that he was going to be blamed for the fallout, put in his immediate resignation 2 weeks after his suspension. On week 4, I'm with my brother in the car eating Sonic and he gets a phone call from a frantic boss asking where he is. My brother said, "I'm in my car next to my little brother eating at Sonic." He started to cuss and shout at him to get back to the office when my brother chimed in with, "If I'm so useless at work, I'm sure lazy and slackers can do it all right. It's not like they're currently at the local strip club every time they say that they're going to a business meeting, right? And I put in my resignation 2 weeks ago, remember?" There was a 10-second pause in the call. "If you want to talk to him about it, go to the club and ask him yourself." My brother gets a call, a 4-way call the next day from the boss, big boss, and VP, all apologizing and ask him to get back to work immediately, to which he responded with, "As I have told boss and big boss, I put my immediate resignation in 2 weeks ago with big boss's signature on it." VP said, "I wasn't aware of this." My brother continues, "Since I haven't done anything in the past month, I'm sure lazy and the slackers can do it all right." It was then they realized they screwed themselves over a false report from lazy. A month later, he gets a call from an ex-coworker saying that the big company sued the company into bankruptcy and let go of everyone. Lazy and the slackers were fired only 2 days after the 4-way call. Karma is a idiot. The next story is titled, Just Make Whatever the Customer Asks For. I used to work in a run-of-the-mill pub behind the bar. Choices were 3/4 ales that changed regularly, 1 beer and 2 lagers on tap. This all changed when the owners decided cocktails are the big thing, and suddenly the 2 bottles of whiskey, 2 gins and a vodka behind me become a huge array of spirits of all kinds and flavors, with a fridge stocked with fruit juices and all sorts. The boss was right, and the new cocktail menu proves very popular. This, alongside a bit of a makeover, sees the pub getting a lot busier than usual. I've got nothing against the pub being busy, but it takes a lot longer to make a cocktail than pour a pint, or a vodka and coke. On top of that, the menu is very extensive and I don't know the names of the drinks, so I'm constantly referring to the menu to make the drinks ordered. My slowness is not acceptable to the boss, and when it is clear I'm not going to learn 50+ cocktails in a weekend, I'm instructed to just ask the customer what's in the drink they're ordering, as this is quicker than looking it up in the menu. I do so, but still check the menu when I'm suspicious that a cheeky customer is upping the alcohol content, saying doubles when the measures should be single, for example. I'm caught doing exactly this and I am berated by my boss in front of a busy bar for checking the menu when there is a queue. Here's the malicious compliance. I start making the cocktails exactly as instructed to by the customers. Long Island iced tea, 2 double vodkas in there? No problem. Misery mud pie has both the Irish creams in, okay. Purple rain with all 5 of the sours spirits in, here you go. I make whatever I'm told to. This lasted all of a week before the boss saw what was happening and allowed me to check the menu again. The next story is titled, Write a Poem About Your Favorite Season? You got it. So I was the hilarious victim of this 2 days ago. I'm a high school English teacher and my freshman class were learning about the Romantic era and specifically, John Keats' poem, Ode to Autumn. I had to go away for 2 days, so I set relief lessons of my students writing their own Ode to Autumn, but with their favorite season instead. They had to create a photo collage for inspiration, and start from there. I get back 2 days ago, and one of my students is very excited to show me their work. They've never been particularly interested before, so I'm very positive and quickly go over to see their collage. It's pictures of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, season 15. I burst into laughter as they tell me that I didn't specify what kind of season, and that was their favorite season of the TV show. They aren't wrong at all. They're now currently writing an ode to season 15 of KUWTK. The next story is titled, Secure It but Leave the Keys in It. Roger that, LT. This happened back in my army days, on deployment to Afghanistan. I was an E4 despite being in for around 7 years at this point because I decided to self-medicate for a while before seeking help for PTSD, and was a bit of a fixture in my unit after spending my entire army career in this unit. Despite my duck-ups, I was well liked by most of my unit, and especially by my CO, company commander, and 1SG, first sergeant, the enlisted counterpart to the CO. I was what the Army calls a deployment soldier, someone who you love to have in your unit while deployed, but gets a bit, let's say, distracted, and has a tendency to get in a bit of trouble when back in garrison, or the US, for too long. I was known for being sarcastic, a jokester, and hard-working when it mattered, but tended to be the typical long-term E4 when it came to bullcrap duties in garrison, for instance taking a 3-month staycation when our O-base defense duty, but that's a story for another time. Also important to the story, I was also known for rarely being seen without my best friend, Jay, who I went to basic with and was lucky enough to be in the same unit my entire career, and if we were left without supervision for too long, well, leadership knew not to let that happen. Consequences could range from the time the entirety of the barracks living members of the company missed PT the day after St. Patrick's Day due to the 3-story beer bong monstrosity we created to, well, this story. To the story. I had recently been switched to operations. Basically they put me behind a desk to be the armorer guy that makes the pew-pews go pew again when they stop pewing from the front line despite having no training and definitely not the best person for the job. This led to me being the lone person on the night shift as troops tend to take very good care of their weapons when downrange, and if something does break it usually has to go to battalion armorers, the guys that were actually trained to fix them, so honestly there wasn't much for me to do. I won't get into all my duties, but it wasn't much, it wasn't hard, and I was bored. Cute side note, the best nights were when the mine dog assigned to us couldn't sleep and came to the TOC, Tactical Operations Center, and I got to play with her most of the night. Back to the story. Before I was switched, Jay was in the lead vehicle which hit an IED. He was med-evac'd out on a chopper, but luckily himself and 2 others were concussed and beaten up, but otherwise okay, ripped to the driver, sadly. He was only 19 and was placed on life support, but it was removed at the request of his parents less than 24 hours later. Anyway, Jay came back to the unit, but leadership was wary of sending him back on mission too soon and he was placed on night shift with me. To this day even the CO and his platoon leader, usually a second lieutenant aka Butter Bar, can't explain why they thought putting he and I together on night shift, unsupervised, for 12 hours a night was a good idea. With both of us being well liked and in our specific company for longer than anyone else there, we got pretty brave and there were quite a few antics and pranks pulled on the company leadership, most of which were tolerated and laughed about, and I can go into detail later if anyone is interested. This antic, however, was not loved by the officers. Not at all. While deployed, military cooks serve midnight chow, which is exactly what it sounds like. Since we were on a larger base this time around, our unit was issued a gator. Think electric golf except where the rear seat and club holders would be there's a small dump truck bed. We would use this to drive to pick up midnight chow and drive back, and sometimes other members of the unit would use it for work or just to avoid taking the buses on base. Well, one particular morning a group of lower enlisted took it to the gym and stayed longer than usual, and when the officers woke up they wanted to go get breakfast only to find they had to use the bus because the gator was gone. Jay and I were berated and told that we weren't supposed to let anyone below a platoon sergeant rank use the gator. First we'd heard of this rule, but whatever, this happens all the time in the army, adjust and move on. Since we were ops we were still allowed gator use so we didn't care. That is, until one morning I left shift with the gator key still in my pocket and they couldn't find them or use the gator until I showed up for my next shift. Thus ends the gator use for anyone but the 1SG, who never used it anyway, the CO, and the XO, second in command to the CO on the officer side, usually a first lieutenant but in this case a butter bar. Our exact orders were, the keys stay in the gator and no one uses it without our permission, and I was told off pretty harshly by the XO. Usually you can get away with a bit argument with a butter bar, the good ones anyway, after you've been in the military for a while, and this XO really was a good one. I guess he was just having a bad day or something, IDK, but I knew better than to press my luck and argue. There's more than one way to break in a new LT, after all. So now we finally come to the malicious compliance. Jay and I were fairly annoyed with the XO's actions, and since we had nothing better to do that night and I sure as hell wasn't gonna let him think his rank allows him to not give people decent human respect, we spent the first few hours thinking of how to teach him a lesson. Knowing the CO had left to the brigade headquarters earlier that day, we came to the conclusion that since we couldn't bring the key inside anymore but still needed to secure the gator, we'd need to get creative. That night, we decided that since we had to be inside and couldn't have eyes on it, we'd need to hide it, or at least place it out of reach. Outside on a smoke break, we saw the connexes, or railroad containers for civilian speak. They were stacked too high, with empties on top and extra supplies on bottom. We looked at each other and immediately knew what to do. We took turns building a makeshift ramp that night, and slowly eased the gator up to the top of one of the stacks, turned it off, left the keys in, and disassembled the ramp. Luckily we left before the XO woke up, and the 1SG didn't notice it was missing since he never used it. Getting back that night, we were a bit nervous, but when we walked in the 1SG tried hard to hide a smile. We knew we were in the clear then. Sure enough, the XO comes to us with a red face. XO, what the hell was that? What was what, sir? XO, don't give me that crap. The gator. Well, sir, you said we had to keep the gator secure from anyone without your permission, but we have to stay inside and couldn't see it. Since we had to leave the keys in it as well and didn't have any guidance, we thought the best thing would be to put it where no one can reach it. This is the point the 1SG breaks down laughing and the XO knows nothing will happen to us, so he says, okay, that was good, you had your fun, but don't put it up there again. Roger, sir. We later found out they used a crane from the contractors to get it down. Probably for the best, no one got hurt that way. Still under the same orders with one caveat and inspired by the crane usage, that night I took a trip to the contractors and, after explaining the situation to them, they happily agreed to use the crane to move a barrier from our mortar bunker out of the way long enough for us to fit the gator in, then replaced it. There was physically no way to get it out without a crane. Things happened much the same that night, except this time we had new orders that we were not to hide the gator at all. The 1SG stayed behind that night for a few smokes with Jay and I, laughing but telling us he can't protect us forever, but he was interested in seeing how it all plays out so he wouldn't stop us from continuing, but tread carefully. We thanked him and quickly came up with our new plan, but this time waited until about 3 AM thinking the XO may have a surprise visit. Sure enough, around 1 we saw a red flashlight beam shine on the gator during a smoke break, and while we can't prove it was the XO, we assume it was. Around 3 we began unscrewing the entire front wall of the TOC, drove the gator inside, and replaced the wall. That morning, the XO unexpectedly arrives with the 1SG before we were off shift. The 1SG walks in and laughs so hard he can't breathe. Hearing a loud sigh outside the door, the XO enters, stares at our work, and walks out, head down, without saying a word. This time the 1SG made us undo our work since it would interfere with operations, and later that night the XO told us we'd made our point and we even got an apology. After that anyone could use the gator as long as it was back by breakfast, and the CO had one hell of a laugh when he returned. The next story is titled, Follow Company Policy to the Letter. Yes sir. My former employer was a very large global enterprise with several offices in almost every country. It was a requirement of my position that maybe once a month I would need to travel either domestically or internationally to service equipment at various sites, sea vessels. As you can imagine, I was a very frequent traveler with lots of rewards cards for many airlines and hotel chains. One day, I would say 6 months into the job, I was supposed to return home from working in a different country. The company travel agent had planned for me to catch a plane with a stop at another destination for the night, then fly home the next day on a second plane. I thought this may be because there wasn't a direct flight maybe. When I got to the desk of the airline, the person said something along the lines of, "There is a direct flight instead leaving in 2 hours if you want to take that instead." The difference was this flight was a 12-ish hour flight, meaning I would get home at maybe 4 a.m. rather than the 2 flights over 2 days and being home at afternoon the next day. To me, and my innocent new to the company brain, this meant I could save the company cash on hotels, field pay, food and the cost of the second plane, including all my excess baggage fees with the mountain of tools I carry. This also meant I could be home earlier and wouldn't have to stuff around. Win-win, right? I said yes and took the flight home. This was my mistake. I landed, took a taxi, got home and received a phone call from my manager. It went something along these lines. "Manager, how did your flight go? About ready to fly home on the second flight?" Me, "No, I am home. I took a direct flight overnight and I am about to crash in bed, been on flights for 12 hours after 8-hour workday." Manager, "No, if you are in the city, you need to be in the office." Me, "I don't think so, I need sleep." Manager, "Okay, we will discuss tomorrow." So I went to sleep thinking nothing of it. The next day, I got into the office and was called for a meeting with my manager, who said I had to put in a day of personal leave because I wasn't in the office. This led to a very heated argument about how I took the initiative to save the company lots of dollars and just fly direct, not to mention I would not have been in the office anyway that day because I would have been on that second plane, so what would the difference be? Eventually my manager simply opened the employee handbook and pointed to the company policy that said you can only travel inside of business hours. He was not going to back down from this argument and I had to use my personal leave. End of discussion. This very pissed me off, having never been told this policy and not having read the handbook, I guess. So I thought to myself, okay, company policy is company policy and I am clearly a pleb who has to follow it. From that day on, I would not travel outside of 9 to 5 on weekdays. This meant no flying at night, no driving at night, no weekends, no public holidays, no nothing. If it took 4 days to travel with 4 planes which could have otherwise taken 1, that's what I did, on full field pay with other travel allowances for every minute of it, doubled on weekends. I was trying to be a team player, so to speak. But after that argument, on top of the travel policy compliance, I insisted on doing all work personally and wouldn't book any hotel anywhere that wasn't a 5 stars or more. I put all expenses on the company bill, including room service, alcohol and anything else I felt like. This went on for 8 years with no one questioning my expenses or choices until I moved on to a different job at a different company. I would hate to think of the Scrooge McDuck vault of dollars a year this one argument with my boss cost my company. The next story is titled, "Done Exactly as I Was Told." Completely true. About 10 years in school, my friend and I was in science. We was doing some experiment with a Bunsen burner and we was both messing around. Our teacher noticed, shouted at us, not for the first time, and gave us both detention for break time, which was after the lesson. Fast forward to break, our teacher hands us both a piece of paper and says along the lines of, "I want you to write a whole page on why you shouldn't mess about while around in a science lesson, especially with a Bunsen burner and chemicals." I was in a dickhead mood. So I literally wrote a whole page on why you shouldn't mess about while around in a science lesson, especially with a Bunsen burner and chemicals. I handed it in, he looked at me and I thought, "That's it, I've got an after school." He smiled and said, "I'll let you off for lateral thinking." Best bit was my mate who was in detention with me was half a page in, started before break, and was absolutely seething I got away with a sentence. The teacher told him since he cheated and started early he can finish. Which made the whole thing even sweeter. The next story is titled, "Neighbor Tells Gramps He Should Mind His Own Damn Business." That advice costs neighbor most of his yard and a car. Gramps had just moved into a retirement park with a lot that backed up to county land that was a nature preserve. His backyard was basically non-existent, but he didn't mind as he got to look out over the preserve. However, he did marvel at how his next-door neighbor's backyard extended a good 8 feet past his, giving neighbor a nice space back there. Gramps tried to be friendly with all his new neighbors, exchanging phone numbers and the like, and one day he noticed the next-door neighbor was putting down expensive pavers that extended from his back door all the way to the old fence posts that designated the preserve boundary. Gramps watched the neighbor yank the 3 rickety fence posts out of the ground and move them back an extra 2 feet into the preserve before pounding them back in, then started to clear the land, intending to gain himself more area for his pavers. Gramps used to work for the National Park Services as a young lad, so he thought he had better warn his neighbor of the consequences of his actions, so he heads out back for a little chat. Neighbor is immediately defensive, and before Gramps says much, Neighbor tells him, "You're new here, I've been here 10 years, and to mind your own damn business." Gramps decides not to press the issue. Nothing happens that year, but the following year, when most of the park emptied out to head north for the summer, the county comes by to check on the preserve. Gramps notices them going back and forth behind his neighbor's house. The workers are pulling out maps and taking photos and making phone calls, and soon more guys show up. Turns out Neighbor has moved the posts several times over the years, and in reality his backyard is supposed to be even smaller than Gramps' backyard. To make it worse, Neighbor put pavers in the back specifically to park both his golf cart and a cherry red sports car back there for the summer, so the county will have to move them before they can do anything else. They tape a notice to the front door and leave. Gramps goes over to read it, and it states that Neighbor was in violation of encroaching onto protected lands. He has 30 days to move his car, tear up the pavers, and pay a fine of $11,000 because of damage to endangered species who inhabit the protected lands, as well as trespassing fees. Failure to do so within 30 days will result in golf cart and car being towed and impounded, pavers will be dug up and carted off at Neighbor's expense, and the fine will increase for every additional day past the deadline. 30 days comes and goes, so a week after that Gramps has quite the show, as first the car and cart were towed, pavers were dug up and hauled off, and the old fence posts and ropes were replaced with metal posts embedded into buried cement bases, connected by steel cables. Whole process took several weeks to finish, but the preserve looked a lot more legit when they were done. A few solar cameras were installed so the county could monitor the wildlife and encroachers remotely. Meanwhile, more notices were taped to the front door of Neighbor's house. By November, the snowbirds were flooding back into the park, including Neighbor. That was Gramps' second show of the summer, as Neighbor reads all the notices, digging down until he reads the first one, then runs out back and starts screaming and cussing up a storm before running back to his car to dig out his cell phone so he can call the county to find out where his car and golf cart were. Gramps stays indoors to avoid the guy as he is frantically trying to unload his car, turn on his water and electricity, get the AC and the toilets going, and all the while trying to get someone at county to pick up the phone and give him some answers. He finally gets a live person and proceeds to scream at them while on speakerphone about his car and cart, so the call keeps getting kicked to other people because who wants to help a screamer? Basically, Neighbor is told to come to the county office to get this straightened out. 3 days later, Neighbor catches Gramps outside and asks if he was here when the county stole his car and destroyed his backyard. Gramps said he was, and Neighbor says, "Well, why didn't you call me when you saw them putting notices on my door? You had my number up north." Gramps said he had thought about doing that, but figured Neighbor would prefer him to mind his own damn business, so he decided against it. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel and post some bear emojis in the comment.